Hi, and welcome to the channel. Here we share stories that touch the soul. Enjoy listening.
I realized something was wrong with my perfect Christmas when the boy I had rented to call me Grandpa asked if overtime applied to hugs. That was minute 11 of the schedule. Minute 11 was supposed to be cocoa, warm, organic, with exactly 2 marshmallows per cup because nostalgia, according to the consultant, peaks at 2 and collapses into irony at 3. Instead, I was standing in my own living room, worth roughly $12 million if you counted the art, 15 if you included the lies, watching a red-haired child check his watch while hugging me with professional enthusiasm. I smiled anyway. I had paid extra for smiles. My name is Walter Hale. I am 72 years old, a self-made millionaire, and on paper I was having the most emotionally fulfilling Christmas of my life. On paper, everything always works. The house smelled like cinnamon, pine, and money pretending not to be money. The tree was imported from Vermont because the Pacific Northwest trees felt emotionally distant. Or so I was told. The fireplace crackled on cue. The jazz record, vinyl, of course, had been selected by an algorithm trained on songs people associate with forgiveness. Forgiveness was scheduled for 8:40 p.m. At 6:03 p.m., my rented girlfriend laughed at a joke I hadn't finished yet. Her name was Lily, or at least that's what her contract said. Lily was 34, warm-voiced, carefully imperfect. She had a tiny scar near her eyebrow that I'd specifically asked for. Real love apparently requires asymmetry. "You're so funny, Walt," she said, touching my arm lightly, exactly where the intimacy consultant had marked with a discreet mental post. I nodded, playing my part. The benevolent patriarch. The charming old man who had somehow kept his humor intact despite success, loss, and a suspicious lack of close relatives. Across the room, my daughter Susan was arranging gifts under the tree. She was 29. A theater major with student loans I'd paid off as a signing bonus. She called me Dad with convincing resentment, which I appreciated. Nothing ruins realism like too much gratitude. Her husband, yes, I had ordered one of those too, was pouring wine and pretending not to judge the furniture. The children, Max and Ellie, were arguing about whose turn it was to love me more. It was all going beautifully, which should have worried me sooner. I had not always been this man. Once, I was someone who believed Christmas happened whether you paid for it or not. I used to think love was inefficient but sincere, like handwritten letters or undercooked turkeys. Then life educated me, thoroughly, with charts. Somewhere between my third company sale and my second divorce, I learned that unpredictability was just inefficiency wearing a romantic coat. If you wanted an outcome, you planned for it. If you wanted emotion, you simulated it. So this year, instead of another silent December in a house too big for regret, I bought myself a family. I didn't see it as pathetic. I saw it as honest. At 6:17 p.m., according to the schedule, Lily was supposed to squeeze my hand and say, "I'm so glad we're doing this together." She did, word for word. At 6:18, Susan was to roll her eyes and mutter something about how I'd overdone it again. She nailed it. At 6:20, the doorbell rang. That was not on the schedule. Everyone froze. Even the jazz seemed to hesitate, trumpet suspended mid-melancholy. I frowned, already annoyed. I hated improvisation. Improvisation was how marriages ended and startups failed. "Are we expecting someone?" Lily asked, her smile still active but now searching my face for cues. "No," I said. "Sit. This is probably a mistake." Susan glanced at the door, curious in a way that hadn't been rehearsed. The kids leaned forward. Real curiosity is hard to fake. I stood up. Old habits die harder when they're expensive. When I opened the door, I expected a courier, or a neighbor, or, God help me, carolers. Instead, I saw her. Time did something rude. It skipped several steps and landed directly in 1987. She was older, of course. So was I. Life had been fair in that specific, unkind way. Her hair, once black and impatient, was now threaded with silver. Her coat was too thin for December, like she hadn't planned on staying long anywhere. She looked at me the way you look at a house you used to live in and aren't sure you miss. "Walter," she said, not warmly, not coldly, accurately. For a moment, I forgot my lines. This had not happened in rehearsal. "I think," she continued, holding up a small envelope, "this was delivered to the wrong address, or the right one 40 years late." Behind me, I heard Lily stand. I felt the room lean toward us, hungry. "I didn't know you lived here," the woman said. Then again, I didn't know you were still alive. That one landed clean. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter is a reflex I trust more than honesty. Well, I said, this is awkward timing. I'm in the middle of Christmas. She looked past me into the glowing room. The tree, the children, Lily's concerned, beautiful face. So am I, she said quietly. Apparently, her name was Margaret. No one in that room knew it but me. Once, she had known me before the money learned my name. The envelope trembled slightly in her hand. I almost didn't come, she said. But then I thought, it's Christmas. People do strange things for less. Behind us, the hired family waited. Confused, unscripted. Somewhere deep inside my chest, a memory I had paid good money to bury started knocking. And for the first time that evening, I realized something terrifying. I had bought myself the perfect Christmas, and I had no idea what to do with the real one standing on my doorstep. For a brief, cowardly moment, I considered pretending I didn't know her. This is a skill money teaches you early. If something inconvenient appears, you rename it, reroute it, or pay it to go away. I had done it with lawsuits, relatives, and once with a very persistent golden retriever. But Margaret stood there with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed my approval, and I knew the trick wouldn't work. Come in, I said, stepping aside before I could calculate the cost of that sentence. She hesitated, then crossed the threshold like someone entering a museum dedicated to a man she once loved and no longer recognized. The room reacted before I did. Susan, my contractual daughter, straightened her posture, instinctively slipping into a performance she hadn't rehearsed. Lily's smile dimmed by exactly 15%, which told me she was thinking. The kids stared openly. Children, even rented ones, can smell narrative tension. Margaret took off her coat. No one offered to help her. The silence stretched, elastic and awkward. This is cozy, she said finally, her eyes moving slowly over the room. The tree, the gifts, the family I had assembled like furniture. That's one word for it, I replied. She turned to me. Are they? Yes, I said. They are. She nodded, absorbing it without surprise. That hurt more than judgment would have. Lily stepped forward, extending her hand with the politeness of someone trained to manage unexpected guests. Hi, I'm Lily, she said. Walter's partner. Margaret shook her hand. Her grip was firm, uncompetitive. The grip of a woman who had nothing to prove and nothing left to lose. Margaret, she said, I used to be something else. That landed like a dropped plate. Cleared my throat. Margaret just stopped by because of a mail mix-up. She looked at me. Is that what we're calling it? I took the envelope from her hand before she could elaborate. It was old, yellowed, the paper soft from time. My name was written on it in a handwriting I had once memorized and later trained myself to forget. I didn't open it. Not yet. Why don't you stay for dinner? I heard myself say. Lily's head turned sharply. Susan's eyebrows rose. Somewhere in the room, the schedule burst into flames. That won't be necessary, Margaret replied. I didn't come to interrupt. You already did, I said gently. Might as well commit. She studied my face, searching for sarcasm or strategy. Finding neither, she exhaled. All right, she said, but I'm not playing a role. That sentence hit harder than any accusation. Dinner tasted expensive and wrong. The turkey had been slow roasted by a chef who specialized in emotional cuisine. The conversation, however, limped along like a wounded animal. Susan asked Margaret polite questions. Lily listened too carefully. The children asked if she was a friend of Grandpa's from before money, which is a phrase no child should know, but capitalism finds a way. Margaret answered honestly, which unsettled everyone. Yes, I knew him before, she said. When he was thinner and angrier. I choked on my wine. She smiled at me. You were. After dessert, chocolate torte shaped like a memory I didn't have. Margaret asked if we could talk privately. I nodded. Lily didn't look at me. We went into my study. Dark wood. Old books I hadn't read. Awards I didn't remember earning. Margaret stood near the door, like she might still leave. You've done well, she said. Not admiring. Observational. I did what made sense, I replied. She gestured vaguely toward the living room. Does this? I leaned against the desk. It functions. She laughed softly. You always hated things that didn't. There it was. The man she remembered. The man I had filed away as inefficient. You left, I said. Without explanation. She nodded. You were already gone. That stung because it was efficient. Clean. No wasted words. I was pregnant, she added. The room tilted. I didn't know, I said automatically, hating how small it sounded. I know. She watched me carefully, like a scientist observing a reaction she'd predicted years ago. I lost the baby, she continued. But that's not why I'm here. She gestured to the envelope still clutched in my hand. You wrote me a letter, she said. After I left. I never opened it. I was too angry. Then life happened. I found it last week, in a box I was throwing out. I stared at the envelope like it might explode. I read it, she said. Finally. My mouth felt dry. And, she smiled sadly. You apologized. You explained. You said you loved me. That sounds like me, I said, back when I still said things. You also said, she continued, that if I ever wanted to know who you really were, I should come see you at Christmas, because that was when you were weakest. I laughed. Came out brittle. Well, I said, I've improved. She looked at me, eyes kind and sharp all at once. No, she said. You've just outsourced it. There was a knock at the door. Lily's voice careful. Walter? Everything okay? I met Margaret's gaze. Something old and unpurchased passed between us. Yes, I said. Everything's fine. It wasn't. But for the first time in years, it wasn't optimized either. Later that night, after Margaret left with a promise I didn't know how to interpret, the house felt larger. The hired family finished their roles with professional warmth. Hugs were given. Lines were delivered. 10 p.m. they departed. Lily lingered. You didn't tell me about her, she said calmly. I didn't tell myself, I replied. She nodded, accepting that. Do you want me to stay tonight? I looked around the empty room. The perfect Christmas, dismantled. No, I said. I think I need to remember something first. She kissed my cheek. Gentle. Paid for. Kind. When I was alone, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a version of myself I barely recognized. Hopeful. Afraid. Honest. I sat there until the fire burned low, holding proof that the worst betrayal of my life hadn't been hers. It had been mine. And Christmas, it turned out, had excellent timing. I didn't sleep. This wasn't unusual. Sleep and I had reached a mutual understanding years ago. I pretended to invite it, and it pretended not to hear me. But that night, insomnia felt less like a habit and more like an interrogation. I kept rereading the letter. Not because it was poetic, it wasn't. I had never been poetic. It was blunt, overly structured, full of sentences that tried very hard not to fall apart. I wrote about fear the way engineers write about bridge collapse. Technically, with the quiet hope that precision might prevent disaster. It hadn't. Around 3 a.m., I poured myself a drink I didn't need and sat in the living room, staring at the tree. Without the people, it looked smaller, decorative, like a prop that had forgotten its cue. At 7:12 a.m., my phone rang. Margaret. I stared at the screen long enough for it to stop, then ring again. Persistent. She had always been like that. Not loud, just inevitable. Yes, I said, my voice rough. Good, she replied. You're awake. I haven't slept since Reagan, I said. That tracks, she said. Listen, I'm not calling to reopen old wounds. I almost laughed. Almost. I'm calling because I think you should meet someone. There it was. The universe swinging back with interest. I don't do surprises, I said. You used to, she replied. Before you monetized caution. I closed my eyes. Who? My daughter, she said. Not yours. Don't panic. I'm not here for that kind of reckoning. I exhaled slowly, annoyed at myself for needing to. She's 39, Margaret continued. Smart, cynical, allergic to nonsense. I thought you might recognize the symptoms. And why? I asked. Would she want to meet me? She doesn't, Margaret said. But she wants to see the house. She thinks I exaggerate when I say you replaced intimacy with architecture. That one was accurate. An hour, I said. Coffee only. Progress, she replied. 10 o'clock. When they arrived, the house reacted again. It always did. Houses like this are insecure. They want to impress. Margaret's daughter, Claire, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, surveying the place like an investigator. She had Margaret's eyes, sharp, unimpressed, eyes that asked questions without bothering to wait for answers. So this is where regret goes to retire, she said. I'm right here, I replied. She smirked. Good. Saves time. We sat in the kitchen. I dismissed the staff. I wanted witnesses, not buffers. Claire accepted coffee but didn't drink it. Margaret watched us both, curious but not intervening. She'd learned long ago when to let silence do the work. So, Claire said finally, my mother says you're not a monster. That's generous, I said. She says you're worse, Claire added. Efficient. I nodded. Efficiency has been good to me. She tilted her head. Has it? That question followed me like a shadow all morning. They left after 47 minutes. Claire didn't thank me. Margaret did quietly in the hallway. You don't owe me anything, I said. I know, she replied. That's why this matters. That afternoon, the agency called. They wanted feedback. I stared at the email for a long time. Bullet points, satisfaction metrics, a follow-up discount if I booked Easter. I typed a single sentence. The experience was convincing but incomplete. They replied within minutes, apologetic and eager. They offered a revised package. New personalities, deeper emotional arcs, optional conflict resolution. I deleted the message. That evening, I did something reckless. I invited Margaret to dinner. Not catered, not scheduled. Just food and time and the dangerous freedom of unscripted conversation. She arrived with a bottle of wine I knew I liked but hadn't mentioned. You remember, I said. I remember what mattered, she replied. We cooked badly. We laughed at nothing. At one point, I burned the sauce and she said, some things never change. And for once it wasn't an insult. After dinner, we sat by the fire. I was angry for a long time, she said. At you, at myself, at the version of us that almost worked. I was afraid, I said, of being ordinary, of needing something I couldn't optimize. She nodded. You still are. Yes, I said, but I'm tired. She smiled softly. That might be your greatest asset. Later, when she left, she paused at the door. Walter, she said, Christmas isn't over yet. After she was gone, I looked at the tree again. Then I did something I hadn't planned. I took out my phone and canceled the New Year's gala, the charity brunch, the carefully curated loneliness of January. For the first time in decades, my calendar went quiet. And in that quiet, something inconvenient began to grow. Expectation. Christmas, it seemed, was not done with me. Expectation is an expensive emotion. It consumes time, disrupts routines, and offers no guarantee of return. I had avoided it for years with impressive consistency. Yet there it was, sitting in my kitchen the next morning, wearing yesterday's sweater and drinking my coffee without asking. Margaret had let herself in. I still have the key, she said, noticing my expression. You never asked for it back. I assumed that was either trust or negligence. Hard to tell with me, I said. She smiled, and just like that the house felt less like a showroom and more like a place where things had happened. We didn't talk about the future. We talked about the past the way adults do, carefully with disclaimers. We avoided certain names. We circled others like bruises. At one point, she asked, do you ever miss him? Who? The man you were before you decided feelings were a bad investment. I considered that. I miss his ignorance, I said, not his arrogance. That earned a laugh. Later that day I went out alone. No driver. No itinerary. I walked through a part of town I had helped gentrify and then avoided. Small shops, crowded sidewalks, a street musician playing a song badly but sincerely. I stood there longer than necessary. At a bookstore I bought a novel Margaret used to love. I didn't read it. I just liked the idea that I could. When I got back, there was a voicemail from the agency again. Cheerful, concerned. They'd noticed my dissatisfaction and wanted to make things right. We specialize in emotional continuity, the woman said. No awkward gaps. I thought of Margaret using my coffee mug, of Claire's unsmiling eyes, of a life full of gaps that had taught me more than continuity ever had. I didn't call back. That evening, Claire showed up unannounced. She walked in, glanced around, and said, "Huh, less creepy in daylight." "High praise," I replied. She sat at the counter. "My mom thinks you're trying." "I am," I said. "Poorly." She nodded. "That's the best kind." We talked. Not deeply, not safely. She challenged me. I pushed back. At one point, she said, You know, you don't get credit for regrets you never voiced. That seems unfair, I said. Life has a reputation for that, she replied. After she left, Margaret lingered in the doorway. She likes you, Margaret said. She tolerates me, I corrected. She wouldn't have come otherwise. That night I dreamed. That alone felt like a breach of contract. I dreamed of a Christmas long ago. No money, no plans. Just noise and burnt food and someone laughing in the other room. I woke up unsettled. On Christmas Eve it snowed. Not the cinematic kind. The annoying, sideways kind that ruins shoes and expectations. Margaret called. Walk with me, she said. We walked. No destination. Just sidewalks and breath and the sound of our steps trying to sink. You know, she said, I didn't come back for closure. I know, I said. I came back because I wanted to see if you were still capable of surprise. And, I asked. She stopped, looked at me the way she used to when she was deciding whether to forgive me or kiss me. You're rustier, she said. But yes. We stood there, snow collecting on our coats. Two old people pretending not to notice the obvious. I don't know how to do this, I admitted. Neither do I, she said. That's kind of the point. That night I took down the tree. Not because Christmas was over, but because it wasn't finished yet. I left the lights, just the lights. In the dark house, they looked less like decoration and more like an invitation. For the first time, I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. And for the first time, I didn't reach for my wallet to control it. Christmas was approaching its climax. I suspected it would be inefficient. I also suspected it might finally be real. Christmas morning arrived without asking for permission. No alarm, no staff, no schedule humming quietly in my phone like a conscience I could mute. I woke to light spilling through the windows at the wrong angle, which immediately irritated me. Sunlight should arrive on time or not at all. For a few disoriented seconds, I thought I had overslept my own life. Then I remembered. I had nothing planned. This realization landed with the soft terror usually reserved for free falls and first kisses. I made coffee myself. Tasted worse. I drank it anyway, which felt like growth. Somewhere between the second sip and the third, I laughed out loud. Alone in a kitchen designed for 12 people and one lie. At 9:14 a.m., there was a knock. Not a polite knock. Not a service knock. A knock with intention. The kind that assumes you're home because it knows you should be. I opened the door and found Margaret holding a paper bag. I brought pastries, she said. I don't know why. I panicked. Excellent instinct, I replied, stepping aside. She walked in, looked around, and frowned. Where's the tree? I fired it, I said. Creative differences. She laughed, then stopped when she saw my face. You're serious? I am, I said. It knew too much about me. We ate standing up. Crumbs on the counter. Coffee refilled without ceremony. At some point, she took my mug by mistake and didn't apologize. I didn't correct her. This felt more intimate than sex ever had. You're quieter, she said. I'm listening, I replied. She raised an eyebrow. That's new. Around noon, Claire arrived. She brought nothing and announced it proudly. I was told this was an honest Christmas, she said. So I didn't bring emotional bribery. Respectable, I said. She surveyed the room. No hired children? I released them into the wild, I said. They'll adapt. She smiled despite herself. We cooked, or attempted to. There was an argument about salt. A minor fire involving a dish towel. Margaret took control without asking, which annoyed me and relieved me in equal measure. At one point, Claire leaned against the counter and said, You know what's weird? I have a list, I replied. This? She said, gesturing vaguely. You. Trying. It's unsettling. I assure you, I said. I find it equally disturbing. We ate too late. The food was uneven. The conversation wandered. Claire asked questions I didn't dodge. Margaret corrected my version of stories I'd told myself for years. I let her. After dinner, Claire stood up and stretched. I'm going to head out, she said. I don't want to overstay. You're allowed, Margaret said gently. Claire looked at me, hesitated, then said, For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't turn out the way I expected. What way was that? I asked. Dead inside, she said. Turns out you're just under renovation. She left before I could respond. Margaret and I sat in the living room, the only light coming from the leftover string lights and the fire I had remembered to build. The house no longer felt enormous. Felt contained. Like it had boundaries again. "I should go," she said eventually. I didn't argue. That felt important. At the door, she paused. "You know," she said, "I don't need anything from you. Not closure. Not apologies. I made peace with the past." "I know," I said. She looked at me, searching for something. "But," she added, "if you're asking whether I'd like to see what kind of man you become next, I would." I nodded. "I make no guarantees." She smiled. "You never did." When she left, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt unfinished, which was new. That night, alone again, I walked through the house and noticed things I'd missed before. Scratches on the floor, a chipped handle, evidence of living that couldn't be erased with money. I sat down at my desk and opened a document. Not a contract, not a plan, a list. Things I didn't know how to do anymore. Things I wanted to relearn. People I had wronged and might never fix. People I hadn't met yet. At the bottom, without overthinking it, I typed, "Next Christmas." No rehearsals. I closed the laptop and laughed quietly at myself. A 72-year-old man, rich beyond reason, terrified of a holiday because it had stopped obeying him. Outside, the snow finally fell properly. Slow, earnest, unconcerned with my timing. Christmas had delivered its miracle. It hadn't given me back my youth, my certainty, or my control. It had given me something far more dangerous. A future I couldn't buy. And for once, I was looking forward to negotiating it the hard way. The trouble with a future you can't buy is that it starts charging you in other currencies. Time mostly, tension, the humiliating effort of showing up without knowing whether you'll be wanted there. On December 26th, I woke up with a mild panic attack and no one to bill for it. The house was quiet in a way that no longer felt luxurious. It felt expectant, like a pause held too long in a conversation. I wandered from room to room, noticing the aftermath of yesterday. An empty plate in the sink, a scarf Margaret had forgotten on the chair, a faint smell of burnt sugar and something human I couldn't name. I picked up the scarf. Wool, soft, entirely unoptimized. I put it in my coat pocket like a teenager stealing proof of courage. Later that morning, my lawyer called. He always called after holidays, like a priest checking whether I'd sinned creatively. "Walter," he said, "we need to discuss the trust adjustments you mentioned." "I mentioned nothing," I replied. "You emailed at 2 in the morning," he said. Subject line, "Reconsidering legacy." That sounded like me at my worst. "Delete it," I said. Pause. "That's not advice I hear often from you." "Get used to disappointment," I said and hung up. Around noon, I did something reckless again. I drove. Not metaphorically, literally. My own car. No driver, no destination algorithm gently steering me away from inconvenience. I stalled twice. The car beeped at me like it was disappointed. I drove to the ocean. Margaret used to say I needed water nearby to remember scale. I had ignored her. I didn't like reminders that the world could exist without me. I parked badly and walked until the wind punished my arrogance. Standing there, coat flapping, I thought about the version of myself that had once stood on the same shore with Margaret, arguing about nothing important. I had been poor then, or at least unarmored. I wondered when exactly I had decided that safety was better than honesty. My phone buzzed. A text from Claire. "My mom left her scarf at your place. Don't pretend you didn't notice." I smiled despite myself. "I was going to return it," I typed. A pause. Then, "Sure you were." That afternoon, Margaret called. "You're thinking too loudly," she said. "How can you tell?" I asked. "You always go quiet before you do something dramatic," she replied. "Where are you?" "The ocean," I said. She sighed. "Of course you are. I found your scarf," I added. "I know," she said. Claire already staged an interrogation. "I can bring it by," I offered. Another pause. Longer this time. "Stay for dinner," she said. "No plans. No performance." "Dangerous," I said. "Yes," she agreed. That's the appeal. Her place was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just seeing it without nostalgia padding the corners. Books everywhere. Mismatched chairs. Evidence of a life that had been lived forward, not accumulated. I handed her the scarf. Our fingers brushed. No sparks, just warmth. I found that oddly reassuring. Dinner was soup. Soup does not respect wealth. Tastes the same in every kitchen. We talked about ordinary things. Weather. a neighbor she disliked on principle, a movie she turned off halfway through because no one talked like that in real life. At one point, she said, "You know, I used to imagine what you'd be like now." "And?" I asked. She smiled. "I imagined you colder." "Disappointed?" I asked. "Relieved," she said. "Cold men don't usually try this hard." After dinner, she asked, "What do you want now, Walter?" The old me would have answered with precision. "Goals, metrics, a 5-year arc." "I don't know," I said instead. She nodded. "Good." I left before it could become a moment. That too felt like progress. That night, alone again, I sat at my desk and opened my calendar. It was still mostly empty. I added one thing: lunch, with Claire. No agenda. I stared at it for a while, half expecting the universe to object. Didn't. The next morning, snow melted into rain. Christmas officially retreated. Leaving behind decorations people were too tired to take down and resolutions already negotiating their exit clauses. I felt steady. Not happy. Not redeemed. Just present. I realized something then, quietly, without ceremony. The fake Christmas I'd bought hadn't failed because it was artificial. It had failed because it ended. The real one didn't. It followed me into the days after, into awkward lunches and unplanned drives and conversations that didn't resolve neatly. Love, I was learning, wasn't an event. It was maintenance. And for the first time in my life, I was prepared to do the work without outsourcing it. The miracle hadn't been Christmas itself. It had been the morning after, when the lights were off, the music gone, and the future still refused to explain itself. And I stayed anyway. The morning after you decide to stay is when the real negotiation begins. No witnesses, no holiday buffer, just you and the accumulated habits of a lifetime trying to reclaim their territory. January arrived like an auditor. The decorations came down across the city with visible resentment. Trees abandoned on sidewalks, lights blinking one last time, like machines refusing to accept obsolescence. I watched it all from my window and felt an unfamiliar urge to participate in the world instead of observing it like a well-funded experiment. That urge made me nervous. I had lunch with Claire on a Tuesday. I chose the restaurant myself, which was mistake number one. It was too quiet, too tasteful. A place designed for conversations that never raised their voice. She arrived late on purpose. I recognized the tactic. I'd used it in boardrooms to establish asymmetry. "So," she said, sitting down and scanning the menu without interest. "What's the angle?" "There isn't one," I said. She looked up. "That's rarely true with men like you." "Men like me?" I asked. "Men who confuse intention with control," she replied, then closed the menu. "I'll have whatever doesn't come with a story." We talked about her work. She did something vaguely in the nonprofit world, which I respected in the way rich men respect things they don't fully understand. I resisted the urge to offer advice. That alone felt like a minor miracle. At one point she said, "You know my mother still doesn't trust you." "I wouldn't either," I said. "She's not afraid you'll hurt her again," Claire continued. "She's afraid you'll disappoint her." "That's worse," I admitted. Claire studied me. "You're not wrong." After lunch, she stood and said, "This was acceptable." High praise. I watched her leave and realized I was smiling like an idiot. Progress is humiliating. The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that demanded participation. No dramatic gestures. No declarations. Just repetition. Phone calls answered instead of screened. Invitations accepted without negotiation. Margaret and I developed a rhythm. Coffee twice a week. Walks when the weather permitted. Silence that didn't itch. One afternoon, standing in line at a bakery, she said casually, "You know, you don't always have to be impressive." "I'm not sure I remember how not to be," I said. She shrugged. "You'll learn. It's mostly about restraint." That sentence followed me for days. The agency called again in mid-January. This time I answered. "We wanted to check in," the woman said brightly. "We've rolled out a new authenticity package." "No," I said gently. A pause. "May I ask why?" I looked around my kitchen, at a chipped mug Margaret liked, at a note Claire had left once that just said "Don't disappear." "Because I don't need to rehearse anymore," I said. She laughed politely, not understanding at all. We hung up. That night, I found myself thinking about the first time I'd realized money could replace intimacy. It had been after a long day, a failed argument, a check written instead of an apology. It had worked. For decades. Until it didn't. On February 2nd, Margaret invited me to a small dinner party. Friends of hers. People who knew nothing about my net worth and cared even less. I wore the wrong jacket. I talked too much. I interrupted someone mid-sentence and saw Margaret's eyebrow lift in warning. I corrected myself. That alone felt revolutionary. Later, one of her friends asked, "So what do you do, Walter?" I opened my mouth, ready with the usual shorthand. Then I closed it. "I'm retired," I said, "from most of my bad habits." The woman laughed. I meant it. When we left, Margaret squeezed my hand briefly. No comment. No evaluation. Approval without ceremony. I slept well that night. In early March, I did something that would have horrified my former self. I apologized. Not broadly, not abstractly, specifically, to a former partner I'd sidelined, to an employee I'd bulldozed, to a brother I hadn't called in years because he made me feel ordinary. Some accepted it. Some didn't. All of it mattered. One evening, sitting on Margaret's couch, I said, "I don't know what this is." She didn't look at me. "Neither do I. I'm bad at undefined things," I admitted. She smiled. "You're better than you think. You're just out of practice." I watched her then. The way she existed without strategy. The way she didn't rush to secure the future. "I don't want to buy this," I said quietly. She turned to me. "Good. Because it's not for sale." Spring approached slowly, like it wasn't sure I'd earned it. And somewhere in that gradual thaw, I realized something else. The fake Christmas hadn't been a failure of love. It had been a failure of patience. Real connection didn't arrive fully formed, on schedule, with supporting characters and curated emotions. It arrived piecemeal, awkward, resistant to efficiency, exactly the way I'd avoided my entire life. And now, inconveniently, exactly the way I wanted it. By the time December came back around, I had stopped flinching at its approach. That alone felt suspicious. For most of my life, I treated holidays like hostile takeovers. You prepared, controlled the narrative, minimized risk. This time, December arrived quietly, without consultants or color-coded expectations. It just showed up, unapologetic, like someone who assumed they were welcome. Margaret noticed first. "You're calmer," she said one evening in late November as we stood in my kitchen, doing nothing in particular. "That either means growth or denial." "I'm voting growth," I said. "Of course you are," she replied. "I didn't buy a tree. This wasn't a principled stand. I simply forgot. When I realized it on December 20th, I waited for the familiar itch, the need to correct, to fix, to perform. Nothing happened. Instead, Claire texted me a photo of a lopsided tree in her apartment, half-decorated, lights tangled like a philosophical argument. "Come over on Christmas Eve," she wrote. "My mom's pretending she doesn't care. She cares." I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I typed back, "What should I bring?" 3 dots appeared almost immediately. "Just yourself," she wrote. "Try not to invoice anyone." On Christmas Eve, it snowed again. Properly this time. Slow, deliberate flakes, like the sky had finally learned patience. Margaret met me at the door of Claire's apartment, wearing the scarf she'd once forgotten at my house. She smiled, and something in my chest loosened without asking permission. Inside, it was chaos. Not destructive chaos, human chaos. Too many dishes. Too much laughter in the wrong places. Someone arguing about music volume like it mattered. Claire handed me a drink and said, "You look weird." "In what way?" I asked. "Relaxed," she said. "It's unsettling." "I get that a lot," I replied. We ate food that didn't match. We told stories that went nowhere. At one point, Claire's neighbor dropped by unannounced and stayed because no one had the energy to be polite enough to send him away. At midnight, someone suggested presents. I hadn't brought any. The old panic rose, sharp, automatic, followed by its quiet dismissal. No one noticed. No one cared. Margaret caught my eye across the room. No judgment. No rescue. Just recognition. Later, when things wound down and coats were gathered, Claire disappeared into her bedroom and came back with a small box. "This is for you," she said, handing it to me awkwardly, like it might bite. I hesitated. "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "That's why I did." Inside the box was a photograph. Margaret and me, decades ago, on a beach, windblown, laughing at something lost to time. I barely recognized myself, not because I looked younger, but because I looked unfinished. "I found it in a drawer," Claire said. Thought you should have it. Thank you, I said. My voice behaved badly. Margaret touched my arm. Just once. Enough. I went home alone that night. Not lonely, just alone. In my house, I finally put up a tree. It was small, artificial, slightly crooked. I plugged in the lights and sat on the floor, looking at it like it might explain something if I waited long enough. I thought about the Christmas I'd bought the year before, the precision, the cost, the emptiness disguised as success. I thought about this one. No script, no guarantees, no applause, just people choosing to stay. On Christmas morning, I made coffee and burned the toast. I laughed, out loud, at myself, at the absurdity of a life spent optimizing for everything except what mattered. Margaret came by later. We walked. We talked about nothing urgent. At one point, she said, "You never did tell me what that fake Christmas cost you." I considered it. "Less than I thought," I said. "More than I could afford." She nodded. "And this one," I looked around, at the quiet street, at the unremarkable miracle of being present. "This one," I said, "is still charging me." She smiled. "Good." That evening, I took the photograph and placed it on my desk. Not framed, not curated, just there. A reminder. I had spent a lifetime believing love was something you acquired, managed, protected from volatility. I had been wrong. Love, it turned out, was something you participated in. Messy, inefficient, uninsured. That was the real miracle of Christmas. Not forgiveness, not redemption, but the stubborn possibility of beginning again, without rehearsals, without contracts, without pretending you could control the ending. The lights on the small tree blinked softly, unconcerned with symbolism. I sat back, alone but not empty, rich but finally unarmored. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to buy what came next. I was already in it.
Hi, and welcome to the channel. Here we share stories that touch the soul. Enjoy listening.